Welcome to 10-Minute Edwards, where we learn the theology of Jonathan Edwards 1 minute at a time. I am Kyle Strobel, your host, and the clock starts now. Well, hello again. I am back with Johnny E in hyperspace to hopefully give you a bit of clarity about Edwards' theological system, his doctrinal theology, and even his spiritual theology and how these things work in his mind. And I wanted to keep going following kind of last time, I wanted to keep going with some of the bigger picture visions of Edwards' theology. And I wanted to think about Edwards' great theological work that he never had the chance to write. Towards the end of his life, Edwards begins talking about this more, and we can see throughout his notebooks and sermons and discourses that he's been really giving his entire life to move towards this great work of theology. But what's interesting, he claims that he's going to throw it into the form of a history. And so there's some interesting dynamics to this. You know, I think of John Owen's biblical theology as a good modeling of what Edwards is thinking, at least in part. But Edwards claims in this that he's going to start with God in eternity. And then he's going to descend from thence into the great work, he claims, and the successive dispensations of the infinitely wise God in time. And then he's going to look at the successive events of God's action of redemption. And he's going to move then towards the end of things. And so one of the nice things is that Edwards tells us he's going to name this the history of the work of redemption. And Edwards has a sermon series by that same title. And there's going to be some interesting features to this that I want to pay attention to. In many ways, when Edwards gives this sermon series, it is very similar to something like John Owen does, or Petrus van Maastricht is doing some similar work. So this is the generation prior to Edwards of Reformed theologians. This is how they're thinking. They're thinking around the movements of redemptive history, starting with God, and then considering how after the fall, you have this series of successive events. And they're mapping that onto then doctrine. And Edwards wants to do this more fully. And again, I'm going to consider the three ways that that's going to give a unique flavor to his theology. And so the first is that Edwards is going to pay attention to how these movements from the fall to the incarnation, that's the first age, then the incarnation to the resurrection is the second age, and then the resurrection to the end of the world is the third age. So notice the years of these ages differ. Right, the first one's quite long, second one's quite short. Third one, we're not quite sure how long that's going to be. But just Jesus's earthly ministry is that second era. It's a small era, but of course it's the very center of history. And so it's the kind of hub of this wheel that's giving order and direction and guidance to the whole thing. But then within each of these ages, you have these periods of time. And so he talks about from the flood to Abraham, and from Abraham to Moses, and Moses to David. And so you have a large framework, and then you have these smaller frameworks. And so the first piece of Edwards' theological system that's going to be important, it's that's going to trace from eternity to perfection throughout the different ages and looking at these different movements within each of those eras. But the second piece, and I want to start drawing this actually, because I want to pay attention to the unique feature of this. So if you think about there's going to be three different, we might call them worlds. That's what Edwards is going to call them. So you have heaven. You have the world of heaven. This is going to be the realm of God, right? Of course, it is created. God isn't, of course, but it's the immediacy of his of his eternal life and existence and engagement with the world. You have earth, and this is all creation, of course. I'm going to just call it earth for the sake of clarity here. And then you have hell, the third world. And so Edwards, we're going to see the third aspect of the uniqueness of his theological project is he's going to claim to do this according to the three worlds, right? So this is what he's doing. But then you have a movement, and I'm going to keep the arrows, off the main part here because so there's a movement going this way, but God's going to descend into the creation, and he's not leaving eternity, as I said, but he's moving things cyclically. Everything comes from God and moves back to him. We saw that a little bit last time. But Edwards is going to say that this big wheel here he's going to map onto Ezekiel 1, right? So if you remember Ezekiel 1, you have the chariot of history that Christ rides through history, and you have wheels within the wheels. So this grand wheel is time moving from God in creation all the way back to him in judgment. And within each of this grand wheel, you have these smaller wheels. And this is the movement of providence. And what's fascinating is if you look at Edwards' notebooks on Ezekiel 1, he begins telling you what these smaller wheels are. And when I was doing my PhD on Edwards, I was looking at this material and I was amazed because when he describes these smaller wheels, it maps perfectly onto his outline of the history of the Work of Redemption sermon series he gave. And so you have this movement of a grand wheel, right? This grand wheel here, this big wheel, that gives order to these lesser wheels, and everything is moving cyclically. So he says, the course of things from the beginning of the world to the flood may be looked upon as the revolution of a wheel. The course of things from the flood to Abraham, as it were, the revolution of another wheel. And so Edwards is seeing this cyclical movement of all of time coming from God and moving back to him. And he claims that things in their series and course in providence, they do, as it were, go around like a wheel in its motion on earth. That which goes round like a wheel goes from a certain point or direction till it gradually is returned again. So is the course of things in providence. And the grand wheel is going to give an orientation and guidance to these lesser wheels. And so Edwards is using Ezekiel 1 as a framing of his entire theological system. He's going to use the movements of providence and redemption to give an ordering to how he talks about doctrine. And the key here is Edwards is going to pay very close attention because, if I can not mess this up too much, right? But you're going to have these series of movements, right? So you have this first age, fall to the incarnation. So second age, you're going to have from the incarnation, the resurrection, and then the third age, the resurrection to the end of the world. So he's going to trace along, and he's paying very close attention to where is the Son and what is the Son doing in all of these things, because the Son is the mediator. And so when you talk about heaven, for instance, in Edwards, you have to talk about which age it's in, because it changes in light of what the Son is doing. But this leads to the third aspect of Edwards' unique theological system, and that is what we call the tri-level structure of how Edwards is going to think about doctrine. So Edwards talks about this as, he says, the history will be carried on regard to all three worlds, heaven, earth, and hell, considering the connected successive events and alterations in each, so far as the scriptures give any light, introducing all parts of divinity in that order which is most scriptural and most natural, which is the method which appears to me the most beautiful and entertaining, wherein every divine doctrine will appear to the greatest advantage, in the brightest light, in the most striking manner, showing the admirable contexture and harmony of the whole. So Edwards is looking, he's going to pay attention to, how does heaven here, how is heaven, and of course that's God's action, asserting its influence in the created order. But he's also going to be paying attention to how is hell asserting its influence in the created order. Heaven is a world of love, governed by an economy of love in light of the holy God at its core. Hell, which of course is the utter privation of all that is good, the rejection of all that is holy, and it is the kind of nervous system of the world, the flesh, and the devil. So it is asserting its influence into the created order. And so Edwards is looking at each of these ages of faith as God is driving this wheel from him and to him. And each movement, each era, he even talks about how empires you see kind of collapsing into the earth, like the wheel that is coming to fall upon the earth, and then new empires rise just as the wheel rises away and goes back. And of course, everything's moving back here. Everything's moving back to God in judgment. And there's a movement towards the heavenly for the elect and a movement towards judgment that'll ultimately show there is a real citizenship in hell. And so all of Edwards' theology is ordered by this kind of movement. And so you have the cyclical movement, you have the ages of faith, and then you have the tri-structured heaven, earth, and hell that'll give order to every doctrine that he has. So we'll continue to unpack these, but that gives you a glimpse of how Edwards kind of thinks about these things in the way he does.
Thank you for listening to 10-Minute Edwards. For more information about the Jonathan Edwards Project, check out kylestrobel.substack.com, where you can subscribe for free. All paid subscribers also have access to long-form content on Edwards, Reformed theology and spirituality, and the evangelical spiritual theology tradition that has a word-centered, spirit-empowered, full-life spirituality. Thank you again.